I want to thank all of the folks who have been holding forth in my absence. Steve Meineke, thank you for preaching, and Adrian, who we want to lift up in prayer, is not here today attending the funeral of her grandmother and her great aunt. And so we lift up their families and extended families in prayer. Neil Washburn, thank you, and Reverend Beth Johnson from Palomar UU. And now I owe her a sermon. So I want to thank you, and I'm just so glad. And you know, one of the things that you always want is that when you walk away from something, it doesn't collapse. And so I have great confidence that you all were able to carry on, and I trust that all was well. Just again to say, it's a privilege to be the pastor of Pilgrim United Church of Christ. I missed you all. I missed you because, you know, in Europe, church isn't the same as it is in the United States. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I've just concluded it's part of the American landscape and culture, and will, I think, be a persistent, though a smaller part, because clearly our younger generations don't see and participate in church in the same way. But in Europe, they've been past church for a long time, but for a lot of different reasons. And some of that I'll talk about this morning. The church in Europe is much more closely associated with war in Europe. And I don't mean culture war, I mean shooting wars. And I had the opportunity not only to travel to Amsterdam to meet my grandson and his mother and just visit with my son, but we also had the chance to go to Germany. And that was very eye-opening for me. And it inspired my sermon this morning, which I'm calling A Just Peace. And obviously the passage that is most appropriate to that subject is Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. One of the differences between the Beatitudes of Matthew and the Beatitudes of Luke can be found in this 9th verse. Now, this 9th verse is not a different phrasing or a spiritualization of a Lucan beatitude, as Matthew does when he changes blessed are the poor to blessed are the poor in spirit. No, this beatitude has no parallel at all in Luke. Scholars might say, and do say, that Luke's shorter list of beatitudes and more direct and compact sayings are indeed historically truer to Jesus' original teaching. But yet, that Jesus would disagree with Matthew on this one. Blessed are the peacemakers. Sounds like it came right out of Jesus' mouth. But it probably didn't. I think that Matthew chose to compose this beatitude because he wanted to reflect the devastating impact of war, the devastating impact of war, and the vital role of peacemaking that he wanted the church to undertake. It is widely known that Matthew's gospel in particular was influenced by the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Gospels were written subsequent to the destruction of the temple. And while some of you who have been to ALO would know how profound an impact the destruction of the temple had on the gospel writings, fewer of us would understand the context of that destruction. The temple, Herod's temple, the second temple, the grand, beautiful, magnificent temple of our imagination, the one that took 100 years to finish, the one that was built to expand and enhance the temple of King Solomon, which had been previously destroyed. The temple that was rivaling the 7 wonders of the world. The temple in Jerusalem, the very symbol of the presence of God for the Hebrew people, was destroyed, utterly destroyed. As a consequence, as we do understand, Palestine, the province of Palestine, Judea, and various parts of the old kingdom of Israel had essentially been colonized by the Roman Empire. So Jesus well knew life under colonization. He well knew the oppression and the harsh treatment that his people received at the hands of the occupying forces of the Roman Empire. This colonization and occupation involved not only the brutal rule of the Roman legions that cracked heads every Passover, so that any idea about liberation and escape from oppression would not be revived. This colonization and occupation also involved heavy taxes levied on the population as tribute to the conquering Roman Empire, as did all the peoples within the Roman Empire pay tribute, pay money in the form of taxes or other resources to the Roman Empire. These heavy taxes impoverished the vast majority of the population. The destruction of the temple was just the cherry on top of the wholesale devastation the Romans heaped upon the city of God, Jerusalem, and the people of God, the Hebrew people, and the entire area around it. This war was a war of the whole region, and the Roman legions cut a swath of destruction through Galilee and surrounded and laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. And this destruction, not just of the temple, but of the whole city, left an indelible mark on the generation that survived it and the generations that followed. I believe Matthew was one of those who was devastated by the destruction of the temple, the expulsion of the Jews from their city, and the destruction of Jerusalem that was such a brutal and cruel conquest of the Romans. They didn't just march into the city with their superior numbers and equipment. They laid siege to the city. Now we don't understand, at least I don't, I'm not a warrior. Maybe some of you who have studied war or been in war understand that a siege is a particularly cruel way of bringing a people to heel. They sealed off the city from the world so that no food or supplies could get into the city. And so they didn't go through the city with their weapons and kill everyone. They simply cut them off from the necessary resources for life. So many people, most people, simply died of hunger and disease within the walls of the city. And if you read the account of the Jewish wars, we have Josephus to thank for his detailed account. When the dead started to stack up in the city and they couldn't go outside the walls to bury their dead, they simply dumped them over the wall so that the bodies would not contaminate the rest of the people. And those who sought escape from the city to seek food and to seek water were horribly tortured by the Romans as an example to those others who might try to flee. The accounts of the misery experienced by the Jews in Jerusalem are too horrible to recount here. But Matthew, I believe, has echoes of this tragedy sprinkled throughout his gospel. He'll talk about the destruction of Jerusalem as a future warning for people who don't have the true faith. But that destruction was in fact in his past. And his gospel is shaped by that destruction, by that tragedy. And I believe his composition of the Beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God," is a direct reflection of the impact the Jewish wars had on him. I don't believe that he was a witness to or survivor of the war, but I think its impact is so profound because of what it means to live in a land marked by war. That's what I found on my recent trip to Germany. Germany and many other European nations, but especially Germany, is a land strewn abroad with the markers and remnants and reminders of war. The other grandparents of my grandson are German-Polish. Father German, mother Polish. And as I was getting to know them, and we were talking each evening, we spent about 10 days with them, and he had dinner every night, and really just, who are you? And tell us about your life and your family. And as I was getting to know them, and they lived in Neu-Ulm. Is that right? Am I saying that right, Anita? Neu-Ulm. I was intrigued by how we could barely have a conversation without him referring to or referencing the war. Now, he's my age. He didn't fight in World War II. But the war has shaped his upbringing and his life. Every other sentence, it seemed to me, was, well, before the war, or after the war, or during the war, because of the war, war. I posted on Facebook that I was visiting my other grandparents in Neu-Ulm, and one of my junior high school classmates, whose parents were survivors of the Holocaust, posted a comment that said their parents met in a relocation center after the war in Neu-Ulm. As we were driving around the city, Roman, my other grandparent, the other grandfather, he pointed out to me the American sector that was occupied by American soldiers during his lifetime. And the buildings are all still there. Now, they've been repurposed, but it wasn't up until a few decades ago I forget the exact year. Somebody, Tom, I'm sure you can tell me, Tom Tucker, all these scholars of the Second World War, they were occupying Germany into recent decades, and those quarters of the barracks are still there as a physical marker and reminder of the war. When you live in a land that has experienced war, it shapes your perspective and that of generations that follow. One of the most powerful reminders of World War II are the 2,000 German ghettos and concentration camps that dot the landscape from Northern Europe to Northern Africa. One cannot escape how the war transformed nations and boundaries and peoples. My in-law's father started the war as a Polish soldier and ended the war as a German soldier. And the land where they grew up and lived, well, sometimes it was Poland and sometimes it was German. And so when I asked him, well, what are you? He says, you know, it depends on what year. Just ask Anita Hirschman how the war impacted her life. She was born in Dresden, Germany, during the war. And her family had to escape the firebombing of that city. Living in a land, on land, that has experienced war shapes one's worldview. When I found out where Neu-Ulm was located, right between München and Stuttgart, I looked around and said, well, what are the places that I want to visit while we're there? And I recognized that Dachau was just a few miles outside of Munich, as we say. And so Gail and I went to Dachau. It is the first of the concentration camps that were built by the Germans. This is the remainder of the foundations of the hundreds of barracks that the prisoners, in which the prisoners were incarcerated. If you go back to that first slide, they let remain a model of, they let remain a model of what the barracks or what the housing looked like for the prisoners. And they talked to us about how each year, as the population grew, the housing could never keep up. And people were sleeping on top of each other. Inadequate facilities for sanitation, overcrowding, lack of food. And then they said to us, and this was all calculated. The idea was that they would work them. They called them work camps. And they did work for the war production machine. And they simply worked, most of them, to death. And if you got sick, you went to the hospital barrack, but they didn't treat you there. They experimented on you there. Tens of thousands died at Dachau. They started with the political prisoners that opposed Hitler's rise to power, and then they expanded to anyone that the Nazi regime deemed unpalatable. Romani, gypsies, gay, lesbian, bisexual persons, communists, Marxists, anyone that opposed Hitler was thrown into this camp. And they not only experimented on the people, they experimented on how to design a camp for maximum punishment and torture. It was horrible to stand there and just to imagine the tens of thousands that died on that soil, and then to imagine, to multiply that by 2,000 other such sites, ghettos, concentration camps, work camps, all across Europe. We here in the United States, protected as we are by two oceans and friendly neighbors on either side, for the time being, have not experienced war on our soil, not since the Civil War. And so we experience war through the veterans that return, and they pay the price of witnessing and participating in war for all of us. My visit to Germany, and especially to Dachau, got me thinking about what it would be like to live in a land where the wars of the past are ever present, especially a war that you lost. And then I thought about the American South. For in fact, that is the primary location of the war that was fought on our soil. You don't have war monuments of the Civil War in Montana or Minnesota or Massachusetts, or I think Gettysburg is about the northernmost battle that was fought in the Civil War. But the American South is littered, is strewn with reminders of the war. And the former Confederate states have those reminders constantly before them. And so I asked the question, what does it mean to live in such a place, and how the people there are still operating out of a worldview marked by war? Now, the people in Germany look at their past and their war, and they take a lesson that says, never again. But the people in the South, or some of the people in the former Confederate states, are still operating out of a worldview of the lost cause of the Confederacy. And they still fly their Confederate flags. Nazi flags are illegal in Germany. The people in the former Confederate states, they have their battlefields, not to mention the reenactments of the battles, and their monuments to the losing side. All of this adds up to a warped sense of reality and an inability to live in the present and function in a democracy where the descendants of the enslaved have equal rights with the descendants of enslavers. The great difference is that the Germans look at their Nazi war markers and promise never again. But some folks in the American South look at their Confederate markers and they promise the South will rise again. In Germany, there are no monuments to Hitler, no monuments to Nazi generals, regardless of their military prowess, no monuments to Himmler, Göring, or Goebbels. But across the South, there are monuments erected and battlefields preserved and plantations maintained, and as an homage to a way of life for whites that was a way of life or way of death for blacks. They should all be torn down, torn up, or knocked down. I was dumbfounded to learn how fast Hitler was able to rise and take over the Weimar Republic to establish the Third Reich. Well, I must confess, as you can tell, I am just now and rather suddenly intensely interested in World War II. What I have read and understood in just the recent week is simply the truth of what Benjamin Franklin said of our nascent democracy. Dr. Richard Beeman, professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, said, "If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that our Constitution is neither a self-actuating nor a self-correcting document. It requires the constant attention and devotion of all citizens." There is a story often told that upon exiting the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was approached by a group of citizens asking what sort of government the delegates had created. His answer was, "A republic, if you can keep it." The Germans could not keep it. The Weimar Republic was their first full attempt at a democracy after a history of monarchy. But one of the lessons learned from the sequence of the two world wars was that the harsh punishment and the enormous reparations imposed on Germany were critical parts of what helped create the environment for the rise of Hitler and a key element for the Second World War. The Weimar Republic was under assault from without by crippling reparation demands from the Allies, and within from Hitler and the Nazi Party. Many have compared our recent experience here in the United States with 1930s Germany. And I think they're right. We did allow, even elect, and Hitler was elected, a megalomaniac with dictatorial aspirations as President of the United States. Now, fortunately, our democracy was a bit older than the Weimar Republic was. Our democracy was elastic enough to snap back, and in Speaker Pelosi's case, to clap back, and expel this threat to our democracy. But remember, Hitler didn't succeed on his first attempt. Even after he was jailed, he was able to rise to full dictatorial status. I believe there is a lesson for us from this part of German history. We must fight to keep our republic and not fall victim to the sophistry and conniving of anti-democratic forces in our country. But there is another lesson, a lesson for those on the winning side, a lesson for those on the winning side of our Civil War. And I don't just mean politically, and on the winning side of the culture wars. You know, we often talk about the culture wars and how it's such a struggle and reactionary forces are all around us. And yes, Texas has, for the moment, banned abortion after 6 weeks, which is, of course, before most pregnant persons even know they're pregnant. But when you look at the long sweep of history from 1950 to today, we cannot deny the advance of civil rights for African Americans, for women, for gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender folk in America, Marriage equality is the law of the land. None of that was conceivable. 2008, the state of California, not Texas, the state of California passed Proposition 8, a constitutional amendment to ban marriage equality. And just in these few years, we have continued to march on from victory to victory in the culture wars. But there's a lesson that we must learn, even on the winning side of the culture wars, or we may wind up getting fooled by the January 6th insurrection and allow it to become our version of Hitler's beer hall push. Our faith tells us, blessed are the peacemakers. We must enter this contest for democracy, for freedom, for social justice. We must enter this contest armed with better ideas, not with weapons. Armed with a deeper loyalty to peace than to war. We must seek the blessedness of peacemakers. And know this, war is the failure of a just peace. War is easy, peace is hard. But our faith calls us to that narrow door, to that narrow path, the path of reconciliation, love, and peace. I know it's hard. It's hard every week to look across the aisle, to look across the hedge or the fence that separates you from your neighbor who's got that sign out in front of their lawn that's not the same sign that's on the front of your lawn. I know it's hard to look across the Thanksgiving table at your cousin, your sibling, or your parents, or your children. How did I produce such a child? But that's what's hard about our faith. And our faith calls us to do the hard thing, not the easy thing. Be blessed, my friends. Be peacemakers. For if we fail, war is a real possibility. January 6th should have disabused us of any notion that it can't happen here. Many of you are aware of the militias and the Proud Boys and the 2%ers or whatever they're called, who are armed to the teeth and waiting for the right moment. So be blessed, my friends. Be peacemakers. For if we fail, war is a real possibility with all of its tragic and unexpected and inexplicable horrors. Matthew knew what war looked like. Jesus did not. So I don't think Jesus minded too much when Matthew improved on his sermon by adding these holy words. Blessed are the peacemakers. Let the people of God say, amen.